In this lesson, we'll be talking about one of the more commonly encountered critical reasoning tasks that you'll find with the verbal section of the GMAT, and that's going to be tasks asking you to weaken an argument. So first, let's just talk about the logistics for critical reasonings overall in the verbal section of the GMAT. First, we know that they are likely to be the least frequently occurring question type. Not guaranteed, but more than likely to be the case. That means there's approximately 10 of these questions, and the 36 question verbal section can be a little bit more or a little bit fewer. But we know that of those 10 or so questions, about 80% of those are going to deal with argument tasks where you have to address an argument in some fashion, potentially by weakening it. And about 20% of those questions are going to deal with inference tasks, whereby you have to note a set of statements of fact and then find an answer choice that must be true based on those facts. Now, strategically, you want to assume about 2 minutes per question as your average for critical reasonings. You'll want to hold to a pretty hard 3-minute maximum for any critical reasoning question. And you always want to note the task of the question before beginning to engage with the prompt. So you're going to have a paragraph, then you're going to have what the question is in most instances with the critical reasoning, and you want to go find that question first rather than reading the paragraph prompt, reading the question, and then rereading the prompt. You will also want to hold yourself to a single reread of that prompt before you have to move to just eliminating choices for common wrong answers and guessing to move on. And you must take targeted notes to proactively address your specific question task. You won't be able to keep everything in your head. You'll want to more specifically write out what would be a good way to potentially, in this case, weaken the argument based on whatever the conclusion is that's provided. And if you are behind pace at your 1/3 and 2/3 checkpoints on the GMAT verbal section, you may want to look for individual critical reasoning questions to skip and move on to bring back some of the pace because they are self-contained. They do not affect other questions, as opposed to, say, reading comprehension questions where you have a passage that is going to relate to 3 or 4 questions in a row. Critical reasonings are all unique unto themselves. So if you are, say, behind pace after question 12, you have fewer than 40 minutes remaining in the section. After question 24, again, you've got fewer than 20 minutes remaining in the section. You may proactively look for a critical reasoning or two to kind of immediately eliminate, guess, move on quickly to get time for other questions in the section. Now, as far as it goes with identifying weaken the argument task, it's pretty straightforward. First, you'll recognize the reference to an argument in your question stem. So it'll say, which of the following, dealing with the argument or dealing with the conclusion. And then you'll probably see task words such as weaken, undermine, or doubt. So it'll ask you to weaken the argument, undermine the conclusion, that sort of thing. And the answer choices will always provide new information to assume as true and determine the impact of that information on the conclusion. So if you see the literal phrase if true, that also potentially is going to indicate that you're looking at a weaken the argument question because you're looking for additional information that would make the conclusion seem less reasonable. Now, strategically for weaken the argument task specifically, they are generally one of the more straightforward critical reasoning tasks. And you'll, once again, always want to read the prompt first and identify the explicit conclusion of the argument because that's how you'll know what to weaken. You'll then want to potentially categorically identify the type of argument to predict what could be a possible attack on that evidence and the relationship that that evidence or premise has with the conclusion. You'll want to, as always, focus on your common wrong argument answer choices to eliminate possibly incorrect options, and you'll be able to potentially eliminate more quickly if a choice closely matches the prediction you have, most likely because you were able to categorically identify how the argument was structured using one of our common argument structures and say this is what it should have done. Now, let's talk about that argumentation equation that underpins all arguments. First, we know that all arguments will lead up to a conclusion, and that conclusion is going to be your explicit subjective opinion that requires some sort of support. And that support comes from what is known as the premise. And the premise is going to be your explicitly stated facts that are intended to provide support to that conclusion. So, in between the premise and the conclusion, that is your assumption. And your assumption is what you're trying to weaken if you've got to weaken the argument task. And your assumption is going to be the unstated fact or facts that must be true in order to link your premise to your conclusion logically. So, in order to weaken an argument, you need to identify additional information that shows that some sort of implicit assumption linking the premises to the conclusion is unlikely to be true. You're going to say that this actually isn't necessarily the case. Our assumption is faulty. And that additional information shows, therefore, that because the assumption is unlikely, that the conclusion would be as well. And your arguments can, as always, be categorized in multiple ways. But focusing specifically on the details can help to broadly predict how a choice could undermine your claim more directly. And that, again, is how you can expedite the process for these types of somewhat common. You should see at least a couple questions on the exam asking you to weaken or undermine an argument. So let's talk about some of those common argument attacks, starting with an analogy. So an analogy is going to say that A is equal to B ultimately. And when A is equal to B, you're assuming that the items are comparable in relevant fashions. Now, a likely attack would be to show that the items are actually not comparable. And the correct answer, if you're trying to weaken an argument based on an analogy, is going to show that there are relevant differences that make the conclusion seem less reasonable. A representative sample is when you take a group of something and then apply it to a larger population. So all representative arguments, they assume that the sample is representative of some other population or a larger whole population that's presented in the conclusion. So a likely attack here would highlight potentially subtle term shifts from the evidence to conclusion to show that the provided sample is not representative of the overall population. So you're going to say, hey, actually, this many doesn't necessarily mean more than 50% or most. You want to look for those subtle term shifts to really be able to hone in on representation methods of weakening an argument. Now, let's take a look at a sample critical reasoning with a weakened task. So, as always, we read the question stem first. So, which of the following, if true, would most undermine the argument above? So, we recognize the word argument, the word undermine. That's indicating a weakened task. Then we need to read the prompt as presented, and we're going to note possible evidence to try and recognize a common argument. And you can see I've highlighted a specific term here because we've got in the prompt, looking to artists for political insights is largely a fruitless endeavor. Most statements made by great artists indicate that creativity and political acumen rarely go together. In fact, most great artists hold political views with no more nuance than those of the average citizen. So we always have to identify our conclusion, and our explicit conclusion here is the very first sentence, and it's about artists overall. But our evidence is about great artists, and that is a term shift that we can really focus on when we try to weaken. So we want to broadly predict what the correct answer should do based on the reasoning. And if we note this term shift, we know that our prediction should be something to the effect of show that the views and political insights of great artists are not representative of the political insights of artists more generally, because that's the shift in representation that makes the sample seem non-representative. So we introduce our answer choices and we process eliminate for our common wrong reasons, starting with a vague impact. So looking at choice E at the beginning, we see some great artists harbor political aspirations. Wonderful. I don't know how many, and that doesn't address our link of great artists to artists. While some great artists harbor political aspirations may do something for the great artists, it does not attack the argument that we have regarding all artists. Now, choice D, we've got another vague term. We've got many, and it says political acumen is a vaguely defined concept for many. Okay, um, so be it, but that doesn't address our issue of artists and great artists. So again, we can just focus on that ambiguous term because again, we don't even know if that's for the artist, the great artist, the average citizen. I don't know who this many refers to. And then we've got one more can up in choice B. We've got great artists can draw large audiences for their commentaries on many corrupt contemporary issues. Well, again, that doesn't link our great artists to artists overall. And we don't know if they do this frequently, how many of the great artists are able to draw large audiences. So we'd have to make a lot of assumptions about this choice to make it correct. So we've eliminated three choices for that wonderful reason of them being vague. We also may have something that needs additional information. And in this case, you could make an argument that B, D, and E all really do need additional information. There is some overlap in reasoning between eliminating for something that's vague and something that needs additional information. But we also need to be aware of task reversals that strengthen the argument rather than weakening it. And choice A, it's not great strengthened, but if an average citizen does not hold uh, particularly nuanced political views, well, then saying that great artists have political views like those unnuanced average citizen views, well, then great artists probably shouldn't be followed. And even though we've got a pretty big assumption of linking great artists to all artists, it kind of strengthens the argument that we don't want to follow great artists at least, and then potentially by extension, artists overall. But if we look at choice C, the struggles experienced by most artists make them very familiar with many political issues. Well, this specifically tells us that generally artists are not great and they experience struggles that make them aware of political issues, showing that they may actually have political insights that could be relevant and worth looking to. So, choice C is our correct answer for exacerbating that assumption that says great artists mean that all artists should not be looked to for political insights. And this would be how you could address a weakened task if you're able to identify a, we'll say, just misrepresentative sample. So let's take a look at some more of our common argument attacks, starting with data and evidence interpretation. So data and evidence interpretation arguments are going to assume that there is no other reasonable interpretation of whatever the data or evidence is. And a likely attack is going to require additional data or numbers or evidence to support an alternative interpretation of that information. So you're going to look at it and go, oh, here's some actual additional data or evidence that changes the interpretation that was originally provided by the conclusion. Causalities are what all arguments can ultimately be labeled as. So if you can't label your argument as one of the other common forms, you can basically just have it as a causality. And a causality says that because A happened, B happened. And any causality is going to assume that there are no other possible causes or outcomes, and that the circumstance, whatever it is not simply coincidence. And a likely attack here is going to instead identify another likelier cause or outcome for the conclusion or than the conclusion. Or it may just show that the circumstance was coincidental because some other time it didn't occur. And our last common argument structure is going to be a plan or recommendation. And all plan or recommendation arguments are going to assume that the plan or recommendation is going to be executed and that whatever the approach is will work. So a likely attack should provide information to show that executing the plan or recommendation will not result in success as was defined by the argument. So let's go ahead and take a look at another sample critical reasoning and see how we can address predicting attacks on specific plans. So in this case, as always, we go to the end, figure out what our task is first. We've got which of the following, if true, most weakens the claim about Canadian schools. So we recognize that key term indicating a weakened task. Most weakens, simple enough. Then we want to read the prompt as presented, noting the type of evidence provided to possibly recognize a common argument. And you can see I've already highlighted must implement because that is making a recommendation or presenting a plan. So starting from the beginning, Canadian schools must implement daily aerobics to make their school children healthier. In India, school children spend at least 15 minutes per day participating in aerobic activities, and they have been shown to perform better in several physical fitness metrics than their Canadian counterparts. Okay, so we've got the evidence from India versus Canada that says that the Canadian schools need to implement daily aerobics to improve school children health. We've got our explicit conclusion. It's that first sentence. And we need to broadly predict what the correct answer should do to weaken that argument. So we want to show that the plan to implement daily aerobics in the Canadian schools is either not necessary, we could solve the problem some other way, or otherwise won't work to make Canadian school children healthier based on the evidence that's been provided. So we bring in our answer choices. We, of course, have to process of eliminate for our common wrong argumentation reasons, starting with vague impact. And looking at the choices, we can see a historically resisted in choice D. So Canadian school children have historically resisted participating in mandated exercise. Okay, wonderful. Just because they historically have doesn't mean they do today. I don't know what part of history that is. And again, look for those quantifiers, those qualifiers that can be interpreted in multiple ways for great reasons to eliminate. You also have answer choices that require additional information. So if we start talking about the health of adults, I want to know how that relates to children because unless it's explicitly stated in the prompt, I can't make any sort of assumption about how it relates to the conclusion. So we can eliminate choice A for that reason. Then we want to make sure we eliminate things that actually would strengthen the argument as opposed to weaken it. So if we're looking at choice B, Indian school children are known to have diets that are higher in fat and sugar than are the diets of the average school-age child. Well, that makes it seem like the Indian school children should be less healthy, but they aren't. They are more healthy, and so what they do may make other school children healthy by reason. So we can eliminate B for something that actually strengthens the argument as opposed to weakening it. And then we've got any time spent exercising is better than no time spent exercising. Well, this is kind of vague because we don't know whether the Canadian children do nothing. But also, if this is true, it makes it seem like the exercise is a good idea. So that would strengthen the plan. Again, very obliquely, very probably weakly, as it were. But it's still going to not weaken the plan for certain because it makes exercise seem more reasonable. But then we look at choice C, which is delightfully bland, but physical fitness priorities vary widely across different countries and cultures. Okay, well, the only evidence that has been presented for this plan is that in India, the children have been able to perform better in several physical fitness metrics. We don't even know what those physical fitness metrics are. It's possible that they're very different between India and Canada. And if that's the case, the Canadian school children may actually be healthier because they're using different metrics than the Indian children in this example. So while C may not seem to be all that attractive up front because we're thinking about other more specific details that are addressed in the other answer choices, C really hits on it because if the physical fitness priorities vary widely across the countries and cultures, we probably don't want to use India as a reason for a plan in Canada. So then let's talk about our checklist for just how to address these weakened tasks. So, of course, first identify the weakened task by identifying the key indicator terms and recognizing that there is an argument with a main conclusion as referenced by that task. Then you want to read the prompt as written, paying close attention to the type of information provided in the premise, and as always, note the explicit conclusion. Then, if you've identified a common argument type, you want to specifically predict what the correct answer should do to weaken the argument based on the structure that you've identified. But if you can't identify a common argument structure, you can just use our generic prediction of find information to weaken the conclusion that whatever the conclusion is. Then in step 4, you want to seek a match to your prediction from the choices, and if you can move more quickly through the elimination process. But if you can't find a good match to your prediction, you can focus on your common wrong answer reasons to eliminate instead. So let's head on over to the whiteboard and take a look at how you'll execute with weaken the argument questions on the GMAT when you start engaging with practice on your own. So here we have a sample critical reasoning prompt. We've got A through E. We put a little line over top, and we always want to start by identifying what the task is. So we skip to the end here, and we find which of the following, if true, so again, there's that if true phrase, cast the most doubt on the claim about the egos of modern architects. So this actually tells me my conclusion before I even get to the paragraph. We know we have to weaken the claim about the MA egos for modern architects. So I'm going to just put a little PW up here for predicted way to weaken. And we read from the beginning. So this comes from an architectural critic. For a modern public building to be considered both functional and inviting, it must fit unobtrusively into its surrounding environment. For this reason, modern architects must be willing to set aside their egos to create functional, inviting public buildings. So for this reason indicates a causality. So we can see that it's basically saying that because it has to fit unobtrusively, they have to set aside their egos. So our predicted weaken is basically to attack that causality. So we need to find info to show that just because the building is unobtrusive doesn't mean I can just use a not equal sign here. That MAs for modern architects must set aside their ego. So now we go to our answer choices seeking a match to that prediction. So in the 21st century, public buildings are found in a vast variety of environments. Okay, wonderful. That has absolutely nothing to do with our prediction. If we've got a good prediction, we don't even really consider this any further. But again, a vast variety of environments, that just asks more questions than answers. So we'll just say that that needs additional information about the varying environments and what they mean and how they relate to the architect's egos and all that sort of stuff. The function of a given building can demonstrably affect its design. So that's saying that the building's function is going to affect the design. And if that is what affects the design, then it might be less so attributed to the modern architect. So, if anything, this would be a task reversal. This makes it seem like they do have to set their egos aside because they're going to have to focus more on the function than trying to put in whatever details or style that they personally have themselves, the modern architects. Now, choice C, again, unobtrusive buildings are not often recognized for architectural awards. Well, if that's the case, and a modern architect wants an award, potentially to satisfy ego, then they're going to have to set aside their egos. So this too would fall under the category of a task reversal. Then we've got choice D. Public buildings more frequently experience cost overruns than do private residences. Well, there's a whole bunch of additional information that's necessary here. I don't know about private residences. I don't know how cost ties into the ego thing. There's a bunch of unanswered questions for choice D. But choice E, modern architects are more interested in gaining recognition from expert publications than from passing members of the public. Well, the building being unobtrusive and fitting into the surrounding environment means that the public may not notice it, but the expert publications still might, and that could satisfy the modern architect's ego. So choice E addresses this pretty nicely. You have to make sure that you don't get distracted by the other answer choices. Remember that each answer choice is equally reasonable to select just from like a percentage standpoint. 20% roughly is going to be all of these answer choices on the exam. So you just have to make sure that you're considering them all equally, and you'll come to E as the correct answer here, hopefully without too much delay. Now, if we scroll on down, we got another example here, rather lengthy one. So here, once again, we're going to set up the scratch work. We got A, B, C, D, E, put a little line over top, and we can see we're being asked to undermine the reasoning, so that means we have to weaken. Unfortunately, this one doesn't tell me what the conclusion is in the question stem as nicely as the previous one does, or did, but we're going to set up our predicted weaken again. And so we read direct comparisons of Africanized honeybees and honeybees native to South America have consistently shown that the Africanized bees produce a significantly greater amount of honey during a given harvest period. Therefore, fears that a northward migration of Africanized honeybees would decrease North American honey production are clearly exaggerated. Oh, that's a mouthful. So part of the reason for repurposing the prediction or the conclusion into the prediction is to make this just make more sense almost in an affirmative fashion. We can see from the therefore that this is our conclusion. So if we're trying to weaken, I want to simplify and not just say show information that the decrease is clearly exaggerated. That's just really quite convoluted English. But we want to show that the North American honey production will go down, basically, because the decrease is not exaggerated. And again, if we don't have enough time to produce a more specific prediction, we can just say find info to show that the North American honey prod will go down after we'll say AH for Africanized honeybees migration northward. So we got our prediction direct from the conclusion, and we go through our answer choices. So, a significant amount of honey produced in North America is harvested by hobbyists who are incapable of altering their techniques to accommodate a change in bee species. Well, we can see that there's certainly a theoretical change in bee species. And when that happens, they can't alter their technique. So, if they can't alter their technique, they seemingly won't be able to produce the honey. And so, this basically is showing that the NA honey production goes down with the AHs because that's a switch. So we get that as a real nice match to our prediction, even though it's a broad prediction. And that frees us up to go much more quickly and just kind of look for those vague quantifiers, those additional information pieces to try to eliminate our remaining answer choices pretty quickly. So in choice B, we're talking about plant reproductive cycles. That definitely needs additional information. Choice C, the migration of the African honeybees from South America to North America could take decades. Well, that's incredibly vague. Choice D, the studies involving the Africanized and South American honeybees were conducted by a joint North American and South American team. Okay, that I need more information about. And the natural harvest period of Africanized honeybees is slightly shorter than the natural harvest period of honeybees native to South America. Well, that makes it seem like the Africanized honeybees are even more efficient. So that too can be eliminated as something that would strengthen, not accomplish the task of weakening. And for that reason, choice A would be our correct answer here. So go ahead and practice your own weakened tasks for critical reasoning questions to get better at this aspect of the verbal section.